Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the Pistola, the 9mm Modelo 1913-16, and I'm just now realizing that's now a mix of English and Spanish. Oh well, this is the Campo-Giro, an early Spanish semi-automatic and their first official one. With an overall length of 9 1/4 inch and weighing in at 2.2 pounds, it's a fairly hefty handgun, but it is necessary because it is a blowback operated 9x23mm. That is of course the Bergmann cartridge, also known as Spanish Largo. The detachable magazine is single stack, 8 rounds. If you're getting to this episode fresh, then you probably still have time to get one of our patch packs. Just a reminder, when these sell out, I tend to get emails for months afterwards, so grab them while you can. Unlike our normal prints, which we can do on demand, these come in batches and then they're kinda gone. So we have a reprint of the Lee Enfield because we changed the way we do the embroidery, and then we have a new one for the Madsen. If you don't understand some of these memes, well, time to review your Madsen history on the episode, huh? And then for the Springfield 1903, we have references to both the Air Service and the Patterson device. So get them while you can, and if you're coming real late, well, check out C&Rsenal.com/shop and see what is available in the future. For our gun today, however, we're not going to be able to get into any real detail until I torture you with some contextual history. Actually, you've already heard a lot of this in our episode on the Spanish Ona revolvers, which were adopted as a second standard by Britain and Italy during the Great War. These were introduced to Spanish Army service by the official adoption of the 11mm centerfire revolver cartridge in 1884. The Smith & Wesson cloned Ona was recommended as the preferred revolver for private purchase by Spanish officers, though in practice they could purchase any revolver that chambered the same cartridge. Honestly, for the era, a top break, single and double action large bore revolver was fairly advanced, so good choice Spain. But that sensibility did not stop there. By 1900, the general staff of the Spanish Army was getting curious. They had been hearing a lot about these newfangled auto-loading pistols. So they would set up the Comisión de Experiencias de Artillería, again I don't speak Spanish, in order to investigate these novel and potentially useful devices. Now, this is where I wish I actually had a different gun in hand, one that I've wanted to cover for the show, but have had repeated issues actually finding and borrowing. One day, we'll get into more detail, but for now, I'll just hit the high notes. Spain would test the Bergmann Mars. This was adopted in 1903, but the production samples left room for improvement. So the design was reworked into the model 1908, which was accepted, but not officially adopted, and then it took a few years to actually be delivered. Honestly, there is a lot to unpack here. And while it might take us a while to get to that gun, what you need to know for now is that the Bergmann 1908 did not truly impress the Spanish authorities. Only 3,000 would be ordered, which in the grand scheme of things was fairly small in number. However, the Bergmann did establish a legacy in Spain thanks to its 9mm cartridge. While technically we should be calling it the 9mm Bergmann Long, this became commonly known in Spain and the rest of the world now as 9mm Largo, an excellent cartridge for the period with performance roughly on par with 9mm Steyr or Parabellum. Largo would remain a Spanish mainstay for roughly 70 years, and for good reason. Regardless of the cartridge, the search for an auto-loading pistol was still on, and there were plenty of contenders from around the world. However, the Spanish Commission was pleasantly surprised to find an inventor basically in its own ranks. Don Venancio López de Ceballos y Aguirre of Campo-Giro. Ha! Mostly made it. Oh, by the way, Campo-Giro was a county created by Carlos IV at the end of the 18th century in honor of Francisco Antonio Campo y Alonso. Armand Venancio was now the third count of Campo-Giro. Born in Peña Castillo in 1856, he had been a career military man trained at the San Fernando Naval School. He moved to Valladolid Cavalry Academy, graduating first of his class in 1879, then the Army General Staff School, which he graduated in 1885 with the rank of lieutenant. In Army service, Venancio would be promoted to captain in 1893 and sent to Morocco. This was just in time for the first Melian campaign, a conflict between Spain and 39 of the Rif tribes of northern Morocco, which ran from October of 1893 until April of 94. In 1897, he was promoted to commander and traveled to Cuba. And it was there that he served during the Spanish-American War, an 1898 conflict that we've discussed before in our Krag Jorgensen episode, and one that saw him further decorated for his actions. In 1899, he became a deputy to the Cortes in Cáceres. As the century turned, Venancio would travel to France and Italy. In this matter, he was surplused without pay, so I'm unsure of his primary reasons for staying abroad several years. Honestly, this is where I have some confusion. At least one source I've read states that he was a member of the Pistol Commission, though neither that same source nor any other seems to accuse him of insider behavior in the trial. So I'm not sure if he was actually appointed to the commission or just considered an advisor, or if he changed responsibilities during the proceedings. Regardless, the Count of Campo-Giro would return to Spain with a firm understanding of auto-loading pistols, so much so that by 1903 he was apparently having prototypes of his own make being produced by Fábrica de Armas Portátiles de Oviedo. This Spanish state arsenal will actually feature heavily in some upcoming episodes, but for today, it would only be responsible for the development of prototypes for our dear Count. Those were a unique, locked breech design. While I do know of patent numbers, sadly I have not been able to get a hold of any of the original drawings which were filed in 1904. I do have this lower resolution copy, and from it we can see the locking wedge fitted underneath the barrel. This design was produced in 9mm Bergmann and even up to 45 ACP. It would receive years of experimentation and updates. There are also examples of a blowback 32 ACP variation. These seem to be less martial in consideration. The 1904 would be tested by the Spanish Arms Commission, and it did well enough to warrant further investigation and refinement. In 1909, the Count of Campo-Giro would be promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, by the way. In 1910, he would take out another patent, which again has sadly not been made easily available. Sorry guys, usually these are actually easier to come across, but the Spanish records are not that accessible. This updated model saw further testing. A handful of prototypes were made, each fitted with a wire shoulder stock. It's worth noting that it was about this time that the Bergmann 1908s were finally delivered, so Spain was well into investigating another handgun before Bergmann could get the work done. More on why in another episode, I'm sure. Further refinements to the Count's pistol meant another patent, and then actually 2 further amendments to the same. This resulted in 25 test pistols, which were now being called the Model 1912. The Arms Commission would ultimately recommend this particular pistol for adoption, and a royal decree sealed the deal in September of 1912. The 9mm Bergmann cartridge was retained, though the powder charge was apparently reduced by about 15%. I'm actually unsure if this was specific to the Model 1912, or if that same order remained in place afterwards when we see, our gun, or actually the precursor to it. Curiously, production was to be handled commercially, not by Oviedo. The state contract was handed out to an I-bar manufacturer, which is unusual because while private purchases were certainly made there, government orders not really. Esperanza y Unceta would produce the Campo-Giro. This firm was formed by Juan Esperanza Salvador and Pedro Unceta in the I-bar region in 1908, though early on they were just engaged in the sale of machinery and accessories, making them parts suppliers to other gun makers. By 1911, however, they had become involved in actual pistol production, even filing their own unique patents. When the Count of Campo-Giro came calling, Esperanza y Unceta worked out a deal to produce his handgun, and again we have something of a gray area. While the sources I have don't go into any real detail, I suspect there was some concern about manufacturing the locking action of that Model 1912, because just a few months after its adoption, Venancio filed yet another patent, this time for a blowback-operated pistol that used a buffer system in order to keep shooting that 9mm Bergmann cartridge. This would be produced as the Model 1913 and was the gun ultimately offered to the Spanish government for mass production. One benefit of this was that the blowback system was simpler and cheaper to produce. Since it differed considerably from the approved 1912, a committee was formed to review the new gun, headed by one Colonel Luis de Santiago. The 1913 was actually approved and found to be acceptable in October of 1913, so procurement could carry on as it had been originally planned. While I don't have one here today, the 1913 was a fairly modern looking handgun with a detachable box magazine and a release button behind the trigger guard. It is of course the immediate precursor to our pistol today, and there are some major internal differences. One of these has actually been handled by our friend Ian McCullum of Forgotten Weapons, and if you'd like to compare it to the 16 that I have today, you should check that video out after this. Now, the 1913's final adoption came by royal order in January of 1914. However, the contract was large, 10,000 pistols, and the product a bit more complicated than what Esperanza y Unceta was accustomed to. They would need to expand in order to meet that demand. And the nearby city of Guernica, well, their council offered a land grant and some funding aid in expectation of creating more jobs for their town. A new factory was therefore built in 1913, and by the end of the year, the model 1913 was starting to enter production just in time for that official adoption. That's frankly impressive. It's also worth noting that during the same period, Pedro Unceta would pass his position on to his son, Rufino Unceta. Now, as I said before, the production contract for the 1913 would be 10,000 units. These were to be paired with a holster and one spare magazine each. Unfortunately, for the 1913, production was interrupted when war were declared. The Spanish were not active participants in World War I. However, the Basque region pistol manufacturers had a bonanza of sales. The French, British, Italians, Romanians, and others all came a-knocking. And inexpensive revolvers and blowback pistols were sold into the low millions, and we've explored nearly all of them over the course of our show. With such a financial windfall, the Spanish government contracts weren't able to compete, so production of the Campo-Giro was halted entirely. Instead of 10,000, only 1,367 were produced. Of these, only 960 were for military contracts, with the balance being commercial sales. The last delivery was August of 1914. Curious point, military acceptance of those pistols wasn't official until 1916. Government moves slow, apparently. Now, in that same year, however, the native handgun shortage was beginning to become quite acute, so much so that one Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez de Aldana wrote, "Any officer who, upon going on operations, finds himself in need of a good pistol is confounded because the Bergmann satisfies no one, the Campo-Giro is not for sale, and the reports on the 7.65 Browning are not the best, and probably due to lack of time or resources, has not been able to investigate other models, and due to his urgency, winds up purchasing whatever the gun shop salesman recommends, or the cheapest he can find." Now, the Lieutenant Colonel here, his plea was actually that officers should try purchasing the Luger when it was available, but it's very telling in terms of how much confusion there was for officers in Spain at a time of heightened martial concerns. During this lull in manufacture, the good Count had actually not been idled himself. In 1915, he had applied for a third and final modification to his patent, so when Esperanza y Unceta had to return to producing the Campo-Giro in 1916, they would introduce an improved model. This model. So let's get a closer look at what they did. Alright guys, we have a fairly modern handgun. By 1916, maybe not the most advanced thing around the block, but certainly in the realm of things that you know how to hold with your hand, point, and shoot, right? We've got a slide-operated gun. In this case, it's a very tubular-looking slide. That, of course, is going to come back in the Spanish Astra series of handguns. I can't imagine where they got the idea for that. But we grab our serrations here, pull to the rear, and it's very stiff, because it's a blowback gun that's firing a full power cartridge. Now, notably, it does lock open, which is actually super cool for that period. Not everybody would do that. Now, it'll lock open until we release our magazine, which is down here with a very unique release. On the 1913, that was up here. Now on the 1916, I can pop that little guy and she comes on down. This looks like it was done very specifically to give us that sort of into your palm retention that was so popular in Europe. It's actually very positive and I like it a lot. Single stack 8-round magazine, by the way. Let's see. The grips on this particular gun are also very interesting. They were supposed to be made of buffalo horn from Thailand. However, during World War I, the supply was interrupted, and so in 1918, authorization was given to use wood instead. As you can tell, my gun has the wood grips. Now, I'm unsure if its serial puts it in the range to have them on purpose, as in it was originally made with these, because a lot of the ones that had horn, if it was damaged, they would be replaced with wood. I believe this even happened to the 1913s. Also, you may see these with aluminum replacements from as late as the Spanish Civil War, so don't be surprised if yours is a little different from mine. While we're talking about the grips, the difference between this and the 1913 is the fact that it uses 2 screws to hold it in place instead of just the one. It's pretty cool. Yeah. What else am I going to talk about? Because there's a lot going on here. Let me go ahead and get this slide back down for a moment so I can show you how you would normally use the pistol. So, without going into X-ray specs, I can't show you a whole lot of internal differences without taking this apart, and I'll brave that after I show you some basic operations, because you notice that hammer's back. It's a single action only in that sense. There's no double action pull on this guy. It's going to, when we pull the trigger, it's going to drop that hammer. It'll have a usual disconnector, so you have to release the trigger, fire again. With the hammer back, you can use the safety. And in this case, this particular safety is worn out. It has a stud that cams the hammer back just a little bit more. In my case, and be very careful if you get old used guns, this is very critical. I want to show you guys this. I'm going to pull the trigger. And it just went right on through the safety. I normally don't want to dry fire, but I really would like to give a lesson to you guys. Do not trust untested old firearms. What it's supposed to have done is to actually block that hammer to the rear. And it's actually supposed to work with the hammer decocked as well. So if you let the hammer down on this guy, and you can even see a little bit of the vestige of what it's supposed to do, it kind of cams it back. It's supposed to lock the hammer in either position and prevent sort of a bounce. It's sort of like a locked rebound position as well. Not working. Fairly common, you know, not necessarily the hardest steel in the world, being played with over, you know, a century. It happens to wear out. We'll still demonstrate its function. Just know that when you see this with Mae firing it, she's not actually going to pull that trigger. But we did want the video to be consistent enough for people to get the idea of what they're seeing when we show the shooting segment. A lot of people only watch that, so don't freak out. Now, what else have we got going on with this gun? That's really it in terms of operation. Throw in magazine, release magazine, safety with hammer back or hammer forward, and it's a slide operated with terribly stiff pull. So that means that I'm probably going to have to get further into this gun for you to understand what's going on. And in that case, I'm going to do 2 things. One, I'm going to pull out a screwdriver, and I'm actually going to open up this grip panel. Now, both grips on this gun had to be repaired by me with some Acra glass because both of them chipped in exactly the same way, so I suspect the gun might be vulnerable to it. Both of them had cracks right about this position towards the front that especially opened up when we first test fired it. So they may get dry, they may start cracking. Honestly, Acra glass does a great job if you dilute it and get it in there just right. Now, when we're inside the gun, we can see the super cool lever release that activates at the rear here, releases off this back notch. That's fun. It has a 1911 style wraparound sear. Again, we'll see that better in the animation. But what I really want to show you in here is coming off the 1913 that we don't have, although you could go review, say, Forgotten Weapons video. The 1913 had this weird stepped milling. It also had apparently a difference in height from front to rear. It made it very difficult to mill these just flat like this one is, and it made it really hard to mill this flat. And so it was a lot of extra steps that were completely unnecessary, and so this ended up with a very square contouring, which actually feels very weird in the hand. If you ever get a chance to see a 1913, I'm sorry I don't have one, at least now we have a frame of reference that's been on screen. Now I'm going to put this back together just long enough to show you how to take this thing apart, which I normally don't get into any complicated disassemblies, but again, our buddy Ian got deep into a 1913, and I feel like it's going to be my obligation to let you guys see a similar procedure on the 1916. Let me get this together. And yes, it is very difficult on this gun. Okay, here's the game. You lock the slide open. I need the magazine for that. You put the magazine in, which then helps you lock the slide open. There we go. The slide is now locked open. if I depress the firing pin forward, it's going to release this cross piece and allow it to come out of the gun. So I'll push the firing pin in, and then I will need to press this particular guy out, which is actually fairly easy. I can do it with my patent plastic and pokey. Now this is where it gets a little weird, because what we need to do is we need to, let me see if I can get it in the front camera. We need to get, camera balance is weird. This whole back assembly is a separate piece and it needs to rotate counterclockwise, but it can only do so if I give the slide a little more ride. There's actually a sweet spot in there that's not necessarily all the way back, and so I'm gonna have to sit here and try to keep it in frame while also finding the sweet spot. Oh my God. You can tell I find it, I turn, and then I slip right out of it again, and I can't bear this up against my chest because then you guys can't see what I'm doing, not that you can particularly see with all my meaty hands in the way. As I get to the rear, this is gonna get weird because basically at this point, there we go, I'm turned, I believe, the full 90. At this point, this bolt is actually held in place. It does not want to fly out of the gun, at least not this way. It's actually being retained not really by the hammer, but by another lobe and mechanism that's in here. We'll see it in a second. Instead, I need to release the slide forward, and when I do, it is going to release the bolt under tension, and mostly it's going to release the slide under tension forward. So you end up in this situation where the slide wants to go this way, the bolt kind of wants to go this way, and then in all of this, there's a buffer spring that's little, and it wants to go missing too. So, what to do? Uh-oh. All right, so we're gonna go for it. I'm going to tension the slide with one hand and release the mag with the other, and then I'm gonna let the slide out. And, okay, the recoil spring's not doing the job for me yet. I probably don't have a full turn. Oh God, okay, we're getting there. Let her out, let her up. Okay, now I'm snagged. Oh my God. And of course what's gonna happen is that all of a sudden that spring tension is gonna let go and I'm gonna be in heck. Now, some of the friction I'm getting is because the hammer is pushing up on this guy. So if I, yep, there it goes. Okay, he's free. That's the first miserable step. And then the second is all this coming out the front. All right. If you've seen the Astra pistols, this part especially looks really familiar. We've got a tubular style slide. We've got a huge recoil spread. Look at that guy. That is a blowback full power cartridge. And that's why it's hard to cock. I want to point out very aggressive serrations help with this issue. Now, here's our bolt, which once you have it apart, it's pretty easy for this extractor to just come right off if you rotate the firing pin out of the way. I'm gonna actually, while I'm sitting here, realign that firing pin so that I don't have a problem when I reassemble this. You can see how the firing pin was the component that was retaining that cross key based on the fact that that notch would go there. Okay, you guys follow. And, you know, boom, firing pin. These are the lugs that lock it into the slide. And then, if we get into the gun, we have a fixed barrel. So this just stays in the frame, I believe. Yep, you can see where it would dip right in there. Those of you familiar with the I-bar type pistols, that makes sense coming from the Colt 1903 family. And then in here we have our little buffer spring, which sits in this little cavity here and also interacts with this cavity here. And it really is this much play. It's not a lot. So when everything comes recoiling back, boom, right? The front of this is going to impact on this guy, and he's going to be driven, I mean, really like a 1/4 inch into here. It's not buffering the gun in the sense of, I mean, yes, it does keep you from beating up the shooter, but what's really happening is we're trying to keep that last little bit of crack from beating the gun to death as the metal finally collides into the other metal. And so we've got a very short, very, very stiff buffer spring. That's really it. It's the final bit of cushioning. Now, the other reason I wanted to get into this gun is you can kind of see from Ian's video, and I'm sorry I'm referencing someone else all the time, but it's the only thing that's out there for you guys to see other than this one. You can kind of see in his that his recoiling buffer spring block just sort of rides in the frame, whereas mine has this extra little bit of metal. We'll see it again in operation in the animation, but don't lose this guy. And for anybody that's sort of forlorn in the future, this is the orientation, and there's a cross piece here, a T, that sits in the frame at the right point in here. You see a relief for it. Just future someone, you're very welcome that I happen to explain that. Now, we can go further because this is a separate assembly for the trigger, but to do that I have to untie it from some of these transfer bars and sear operations, and again, this is why we have an animator. You can also see, probably, let me see if I can get that in camera, you can see the safeties rotating block, and then in the rear position, that central point, I believe, is what is supposed to be camming the hammer. Don't hold me to that. And again, I have an animator for a reason, but I believe that's what's worn out and is preventing the safety from operating appropriately. So as a matter of fact, I can even stack it, and you can see it'll even rest on the safety. And then if I release the safety, it'll try to fall forward. Yeah, always inspect your historic firearms. All right, reassembly is the process in reverse. And to be honest with you, there's no real reason for me to struggle on camera with it. I will say, let me go ahead. I've already told you the correct alignment for this guy, but just to be sure, the future guy who gets in trouble, there you go. The one thing I will say is that when you set this up, this buffer should go into, let me get it so I can show it to the camera. It should go into its little home right there where it can't travel any further forward. I'm sorry, that's probably out of focus. Can't travel any further forward. You don't want it to accidentally ride up, it'll bind the action. And also it would allow the little buffer spring to escape if it got too far away from Mama barrel. So from there, you can take your barrel and tip it, drop it in. It becomes a balancing act to get this all back together, but it really does go back together the same way in reverse, except I will say, don't forget what I told you before. When this thing is rotated, it's 90 degrees, it has a cutaway that fits this particular bump, and then another little cutaway that fits the hammer. So you're gonna align it just like this, and then pull the slide over it, and then kind of give it a little depress on the hammer, and scoot her down, and you're good to go. You're just gonna get filming of me grunting. I'll put this together off camera. Now, I did not plan to have this segment in the episode, but in reassembling this pistol, specific to the 1916, I noticed something that I really need to address. I know I told you guys that there's a spot up here for this little T-juncture on what is essentially the trigger disconnect transfer cradle plate thing, animation. But you can, in theory, and actually in practice, because I just did it, if you're not paying attention, you can just set this guy in here, and the gun will reassemble, and it will fire in that position, but there's a hump. It has a weird sort of binding as you get 75% of the way back on the slide. So I got worried and went back in the gun because that wasn't there when I started. And what I noticed is you very specifically have to take the front edge of this guy and put him under that little lip. That is critical, and I do believe the gun would be damaged if you tried running it without it being in that position. Once it drops in, now we're nice and flush. Actually, we're low on the inside across this top, and it means we won't get that binding action. So anyone who has a Campo-Giro, you're welcome, because this would have thrown a number of people for a loop, I believe. Now, despite being called the Model 1316, it was a new model and it would require approval. The first production samples were completed again by late 1916 and were reevaluated by a committee led by Captain Raphael Stuck. They were finally deemed acceptable in 1917. With that, we can probably dig out the X-ray specs and get a look inside this guy.
First, we'll load up our detachable box magazine, which is retained by a simple spring-loaded catch at the rear. The release looks complicated, but it's really just wrapped around. Next, pull the slide to the rear and release to chamber our first round. This action works on a simple blowback using a large recoil spring. The fired cartridge drives the slide rearward, compressing the mainspring. Once halted, the mainspring drives the slide back forward, picking up a fresh cartridge in the process. Looking at the action, the hammer and sear share a singular flat spring. When released, the hammer falls, striking the firing pin. As the slide recoils, it recocks the hammer. The sear is simple and straightforward, however it's attached to a long stirrup-like transfer bar. It wraps around both sides of the magazine, creating even pressure on the sear. Pulling the trigger cantilevers the transfer bar forward, which in turn pulls the sear from the hammer. Automatic fire is prevented by this disconnect, which is an unusually shaped piece of flat steel. As the slide recoils, it presses down on the wings of the disconnect. which in turn presses down on the transfer bar, releasing it from the trigger. This uniquely shaped spring both tensions the trigger and keeps upward pressure on the transfer bar, which allows both to reset. Unique to the Campo-Giro is a small but very stiff buffer spring, which sits between the frame and a short distance sliding yoke. The yoke is only compressed against the spring at the last few millimeters of travel. This is meant to prolong the life of the action, preventing cracking under extreme impact. The safety has two operating surfaces. When rotated, the first set turn into a half-cock notch on the hammer. At the same time, another set of surfaces has blocked the slide from being moved. The safety is biased into its two positions by a spring and a plunger, which is actually housed in the multifunction ejector. This complicated shape has three jobs. The first we already covered with the safety. The second is, as the name implies, ejecting the spent casing, with the help of the extractor, of course. Finally, it biases this slide hold open, which wraps all the way around the magazine and is about 1/2 of the feed ramp. When the magazine is empty, the follower tips the front of the hold open, which in turn snags the slide. Amazing all the way around. Let's go shoot it.
You know, I know shooting looked fairly normal for this guy, but I can't wait to talk to Mae about it. It's got some weird ergonomics. Before that, however, we have to cover some more history. Production had begun again in late 1916 and would continue into 1919 with final deliveries to the military in January of 1920. A total of 13,157 were produced for the military, with only roughly 500 being made commercially. The proof of Spanish martial use is a three-pointed sort of star thing in a circle at the rear left tang of the gun. While issue of the 1913 model had been for officers and I believe maybe cavalry, the 1316 was adopted at the same time as an expansion of the pistol's role in the Spanish army, so they would be also issued to machine gunners and sappers and demolition troops. Each pistol had an allotment of 50 rounds, 25 rounds for initial training, 25 rounds for maintaining skill. I believe that 25 was annual. Also, if you were particularly good with your pistol, you could get 25 more rounds for extra development. Campo-Giro pistols of both types would have likely been used in the Rif War, another Moroccan conflict fought in the Rif mountainous region. This war would span from 1920 into 1927 and eventually involve France as well. I'm sorry to say that I can't seem to find any comments on how well or poorly liked these pistols were. That may be because even at the start of the war, the Campo-Giro was on its way out. Esperanza y Incenta would introduce a new handgun for testing, and in 1921 it was already adopted. But that again is a great story for another day. Boy, it sure does look familiar though. While the 1921 replaced both the Bergmann and the Campo-Giro in service, both were left in operation so long as maintenance components were available, and as a result, the Campo-Giro would be involved in the Spanish Civil War, albeit not as commonly as other firearms. Those still found in inventory after that, well, in the 1960s, they were purchased in, to my understanding, 2 lots by Samuel Cummings of the International Armament Corporation. By this point, their numbers were depleted, though I'm unsure by how much. Today, the 16 and especially the 13 are rarely encountered by collectors. Returning to our inventor, he would unfortunately pass away just about the time his improved 1916s were being received and approved by the government. He had apparently suffered some sort of fainting spell while riding his horse, which bolted in surprise and deposited him on his head, hard enough to fracture his skull. He would die from his injuries on May 22nd of 1917. And you know, that's kind of the reason why we have to have Mae come in at the end of each episode, because I don't really want to always have to stop the show on the most depressing bits, because they're always the last of people's lives. So let's see if she can cheer us up by discussing her opinion on the Good Count's pistol. Once more, we've made room for Mae, and we have the Campo-Giro, or Giro, or Giro. I keep calling it the Giro, because I don't speak Spanish.
Well, so far no one has corrected us that speaks Spanish around us, so...
Yeah, but that doesn't, they could just be used to me pronouncing things terribly.
It's true.
We get way more engagement when I don't pronounce things right, so I should probably just go with that. Okay. But I also don't want to call it the...
Matthias.
I don't want to call it the Campo-Giro, because then I'll just get hungry, because I'll think like Giro, you know?
Yeah.
And was that, I remember back in college, this has nothing to do with the gun, but you guys...
Oh, wow. So we were going too deep into the first take, but this take's fine.
I was at college, and I wanted, they had like, Giro Day, right?
Wait, literally they had a day of it?
Yeah. Well, at the cafeteria, it was like it was like that or lasagna. I don't know. Anyway, I go up to the lunch lady at this... Go up to the lunch lady, which, by the way, they had lunch ladies at my college. It's not fancy like now.
Yeah.
This is long ago. And I said, oh, she's like, do you want the whatever? And I was like, oh, no, I'll take the gyro. And she goes, gyro. And I went, what? And she's like, gyro. And I went, yeah, the gyro, it's fine. Because I don't know that we're in a thing.
Right.
And then she's like, gyro. She wouldn't let me have one
until
I said
wrong?
gyro.
What is that?
I don't know. Anyway, let's talk about the Campo whatever it might be. Here's the pistol.
Thank you.
It's a weird showdown. When you're first...
Did you pronounce it wrong?
I don't know. I guess I'm not... I don't get hung up on pronunciations, but she did. Badly. So, first handed the gun.
Okay.
Forget about the lunch lady.
I'm going to try. It's going to be in the back of my mind, but I'm going to try.
What are your impressions of this gun? Actually, let's talk visually before we even talk about handling it.
Visually? This visually looks like something I would draw if I were, like, under 10 years old. Like, if I did just thinking of a gun, like, general trigger area, just a little bloop there for the trigger. You know, general, like, tubular shape or just shape of what the barrel is, and then a rectangle here for the mag.
Yeah, the grip's a rectangle, the trigger is a circle, and all of this is a tube because barrel. Yeah.
Tube.
It's almost, you could almost not really tell it has a slide.
Oh yeah, that's super weird, isn't it? Like it's weird that it's like a tube, but then it's like I don't know.
You get some tube with the tube inside and a little more tube at the back.
Tube. Did you want tube in your tube? Because that's what this is.
Okay, so handling it now.
Yeah. So this kind of, if you just look at some of the base features, is pretty modern for a lot of the pistols that we've handled for this series, because we have a detachable box magazine, goes inside of it, and we have a slide that we operate, you know, pulling back to...
Yeah. How's that slide?
A little stiff.
Yeah.
Just a tad, but hey, it locks open. Pretty modern. But like compared to a lot of the pistols we handle for the series, just those two features alone make it incredibly modern, especially for the caliber that this gun is.
But Mae, there's all these pistols that you have that are slide op. They're all 32s.
Yeah, all of them are 32s.
If you really think about it for our series, I know everybody knows the Colt 1911, slide operated, full powered handgun, right?
Right. We haven't handled that yet.
We have the Webley self-loader navel that we shot.
Pretty decent cartridge.
Full-powered cartridge.
Yep.
Lock breech, semi-automatic detachable magazine, right?
We have the Steyr-Hahn, decent cartridge, but
no detachable magazine.
Yeah.
Right? You have the Luger, which is the other way around, detachable magazine, but no
weird.
slide.
Yeah, well, it's got that
power.
weird knobs that you grab.
Right. And then you have like stuff, I think probably the closest thing to this that we've seen so far would be the FN 1903 / Swedish 1907.
Yes.
That Browning blowback, but it's a downgraded 9mm Browning 9mm. It's not as powerful as Largo.
That's the closest thing to this.
Largo stands up there with Steyr and Parabellum. It is a full-powered 9mm cartridge, but this is a blowback gun, which you can tell when you try to work the slide like Mae just did.
God, yeah, okay, so that slide is incredibly stiff, and you saw him take this apart on camera, so that spring is massive in there that we're having to fight to pull her back.
Right. Does the buffer spring really feel like it's doing anything to ruin what you're doing with it?
I can't honestly say I think I notice it.
Mechanically, I took it out and played with it.
I remember seeing it was super tiny on camera, and when we took it apart, it was just like a wee little thing.
It's honestly only responsible for the over travel. So the buffer spring shouldn't be feeling like anything when you're opening this up. It shouldn't be adding to what you're doing to work the gun.
To be fair, I don't know if I notice or not, but all I know is that it's still incredibly difficult to operate this slide. And these serrations are aggressive, but are absolutely necessary.
They are like reverse cut, hard edge serrations.
Oh, yeah. I've got like marks on my finger. Yeah, I've still got the marks there just from operating that. That's great. But yeah, getting into other features on this guy. I'm able to drop the mag. Granted, it is a heel release, but it is a very positive push heel release. Like, it drops it out. Like, and I got in the way of this one a little bit here, which that's still pretty decent. The safety, it is one that you do have to break your grip for a little bit, but it's not difficult to operate one-handed. However, this one, again, we did mention is unfortunately broken.
Yeah, more worn out than broken.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
I do like that it gives you two positions. So you can cock and lock, which does not work on this gun.
Right.
Or if you already had your hammer down, it'll cam it back a bit, get it off the firing pin.
Yeah, just slightly off of it.
It's a good safety. It's just that horrible rear position, you know?
Right, yeah, where it's they always just want you to reach back with your thumb, which is just such a bizarre placement.
Not terrible, but just not ideal.
Yeah, and then again, we mentioned it earlier, the trigger. This guard just feels like they just blooped it on there like a little wart on a hand kind of thing. It just kind of sticks out there, and it creates this weird little crevice that, I don't know about you, I kind of found after a few rounds my hand kind of slipping behind there.
So do you want to talk about firing the gun?
Oh, God. Okay, so lining up the sights, I'm like, interesting. Okay, so the sights they're not bad, they're okay.
Yeah.
But they're kind of bulbousy, and it's like I'm looking at a flower, like petal, and then the dip in between the next petal, like it's two petals, and then the dip in between is where I look for the front sight.
This is like the couch that you want to actually sleep on, but not the one that you want to show off in your house.
Yeah.
You know, like the sights are very soft.
Yeah, they're
and round.
Weird. They're very round. They're not difficult. They're not too difficult to find the front sight, but they're unusual that I'm not used to them. So maybe that's why it took me a split second.
I'm gonna be honest. I had a hard time focusing on them because they're so round. So for me, I found the front sight. I found the rear sights very quickly. I pointed them very quickly. I feel like I could get on body at 30 feet very quickly. Now, if I wanted to bullseye something,
that would be a little difficult with this one.
They're just so
curved.
Soft.
Yeah, soft is a good way to phrase that. Yeah.
I can't find the top of the sights to really get lined up on a true vertical position.
Yeah, it's strange. I think it would be something that would take some practice to become, super accurate with.
Right.
But no problem finding the target, at least landing my shots on it.
All right, so you managed to rack the slide through great endeavor. You've lined up your sights, which are confusing.
And then, I don't know if I mentioned it, this is actually pretty muzzle heavy, so I'm kind of balancing it a little bit with my middle finger. Like, I'm kind of holding it up a little bit, too.
You got a little heel toe going on.
Yeah. And then the trigger on this one, it's not too bad. It's just, it's, I guess, moderate in weight, I want to say, in terms of the pull-through. Like, it's...
Today,
it's heavy today, probably.
Yeah,
but
for today, you consider it a heavy trigger today. Not a terrible one, just a heavy one.
But it's smooth.
Yes.
That much I did appreciate.
For the time period, it's not anywhere near the heaviest trigger we've had. I'd consider this a fairly average trigger for a handgun at that period. However, what you said about smooth, it has the 1911 style transfer yoke that goes around the magazine on both sides and is evenly supported. And so it's very smooth. I found it to be actually quite easy to hold a group mechanically.
Yes.
The sights aren't helping you hold the group.
No.
But
That's the trick.
The mechanism is, other than, well, let's talk about what happens when it goes bang.
Okay, so when it goes bang, I'm already going to expect this to have substantial recoil just because of the size of the cartridge. So I'm expecting that there. But what I'm not expecting is what happens with the recoil, because there were 2 points on my hand that kind of felt the significant impact on it. One, of course, being the webbing between my forefinger and my thumb. Like, this back of the grip just...
It's kind of pink just from you holding it.
Yeah, it really doesn't fit well in that webbing space. Like, it grates your hand wrong. Like, it pinches you in a weird spot. And then the one that you should and just don't necessarily expect, but just from looking at it, some of you probably already know, with my middle finger right there behind the trigger guard, it is catching a significant amount of impact, and it busted my knuckle once or twice on range pretty good.
Yeah, the trigger guard's a separate piece, and I'm unsure if there's some springing going on or something.
I don't know. That's true. It is a separate piece, so that could be part of the reason.
There's actually, when we were in there, you can see there's components at the front of it that want to drive themselves upwards, and then the action drives them downwards. And I'm wondering if somewhere in all this flex, I wonder if the trigger guard itself is actually getting a little bit of a bump to it.
Maybe.
Because when I shoot this gun with my larger hand, it happened to me once or twice.
Yeah, once or twice it happened to me, but I think that's because my knuckles are slightly smaller. But for you, every time?
I fill up that space. So I'm pressed in, I'm almost squeezed in there in order to get a good grip on the gun. And so when I fired it, this whole thing flexed, I think, and just beat the ever-loving snot out of my knuckle. In addition, despite having larger hands, I still felt the webbing of my hand getting kind of torn up. I think maybe because of the wood texture of the grip coming around, or the fact that it's just right there with the metal back.
Maybe.
There's something about this arrangement that it really pummels the inside of your
You feel that
webbing.
recoil all throughout on both sides of your hand, that's crazy bizarre. I mean, granted, again, a full-powered cartridge, but not quite what I was expecting with that.
Well, would you say it's a pleasant gun to shoot?
I mean, not one I want to shoot all day necessarily, but...
Were you relieved to be done with the magazine?
Yeah, I was relieved to be done with the magazine. But it was not terrible for... Like I said, the sights weren't fantastic and getting, like, deadly accurate with it, but I still had all my shots on target with it.
I found it to be a competent pistol. Like, I would actually trust this fairly well myself. I'll let you make your call.
To be honest... I can't see myself turning this one down.
Ooh, so we're already there. Would you have it in World War I thing?
Yeah, I really can't see myself saying no to this guy, because we've got our full-powered cartridge. We've got a mag that's in the gun. We've got, 8 rounds in this guy? That's not bad for the full power. And then slide operated. I've got a safety, and the trigger's actually pretty decent.
Right.
The only thing I wish they'd improved upon really was the sights and maybe actually connecting the trigger guard a little further back, but beggars can't be choosers with that. Otherwise, everything else you can pretty well manage on your own with this one. It's a pretty decent gun.
Yeah, this gun, it's interesting. I put it somewhere in the vague ballpark in terms of how I trust it. I put it somewhere in the vague ballpark of the Webley self-loader in 4.55 auto.
Above it or below it? I put it above it, weirdly.
I could see that argument. I haven't shot either enough to be sure, but there are things that the Webley self-loader does that make me nervous that this does not do, but the Webley self-loader also has a locking breech.
That's true.
So, but this thing is, they're both probably near the same weight, but this one's nowhere near as boxy. I don't know, it's really weird.
This one ergonomically feels slightly better, I think, even though it still beats the crap out of you.
I think, honestly, if I care about having the little extra oomph, I would take this over, say, the FN 1903. But in terms of ergonomics, I would take the FN 1903.
All day.
Right.
All day long.
So
no question.
That's where it gets to be sort of a hard call. I'd probably still prefer the FN 1903 over this in general for actually carrying and using. But you can make an argument that I would not be uncomfortable with this gun either.
Well, also, if you think about it, if you're having to shoot one of them all day long, yeah, you're taking the FN 1903.
Yeah, but that's not really the argument, is it, though? When you're talking about having it for combat, the number one argument for a handgun in combat is portability and not getting damaged while it's just sitting on your hip for days and days and days. Because you're only going to need it, 1 or 2 times if you're lucky. You really don't.
True.
You'd much rather it just sort of be there and be out of the way, but then you can grab it in a hurry and just use it. So the weight and sort of the awkwardness of the grip are what puts this out. Also, a little bit like I really don't want my hand beat to death while I'm trying to struggle for my life.
Nah, that's not something that you want to have to focus on, and you don't want to have that instant of hesitation before pulling the trigger.
Or just that wince, like just having it built in,
It's like, oh, no, it's going to hurt. No, it's going to hurt.
But you would say yes, though, right?
Yeah, I would say yes to this one. I think it's a pretty moderate yes.
This is interesting because there's obviously 32 ACPs that are way more accurate, way more easily carried, easier to use.
Oh, yeah.
But you really like having that Largo, don't you?
It's a more powerful cartridge. On top of that, a lot of those 32s, I might have been getting up to 8 rounds on some of them, but most of them it was closer to like 7 rounds.
That's true.
I got at least 8 rounds in this guy. That's not bad.
And supposedly the way this thing was sent out was with a holster with a spare magazine, which is also not always common on semi-automatic pistols, even with detachable magazines.
That's pretty decent.
So you would have had 2 mags.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Honestly, I give high marks to the Campo-Giro.
Yeah.
It's way overcomplicated for what it's doing, though. Honestly, it's kind of weird. To me, this gun really, when I take it apart, it would make no sense to me whatsoever. Unless I knew that it was a lock breech pistol before suddenly being turned into a blowback. Because as a blowback, it's insane.
Oh, yeah.
And as a matter of fact, we'll see this concept completely redone on the Astra 400. One of these days, we'll get into that gun.
So foreshadowing into the future.
It looks similar. It's tubular. It's got it's a blowback 9mm
logo. It is kind
logo.
of Astra-esque with that cylindrical tube.
Well, it's
shape.
almost like the Astra was developed by a company that was making this.
God,
so, but the Astra makes a lot more sense as a blowback pistol than this one does because it simplifies and simplifies and simplifies. This thing is over-engineered, to be honest with you. But it's really cool.
That's pretty rad.
So very glad to have it here. Very glad to try it out.
Oh yeah.
What do you think, Mae? Would you be ashamed to own one of these?
Oh no, I wouldn't be ashamed. In fact, I'm happy that it probably would be one that we would have in our collection.
Yeah. Hopefully this gives it a little more popularity. I feel like it didn't get the renown that it deserves. All right. Well, I think that's got us wrapped up for the moment. So join us after the credits for any updates, and otherwise have a good one.
Night, everybody.
All right, gang, for those of you who had stayed to the end, I assume you've all already gotten your patch packs. I'd like to point out, by the way, this Crozier poster, along with Lewis there in the middle, this is real. You can get this. This came out of the Discord, and a lot of people said they wanted it. So it's printed on demand. Grab it whenever you want, but it's in the shop. If we do well enough on these, I think maybe we should do a t-shirt, but I really don't know how many people actually want Crozier product versus just, the handful that really like seeing them on occasion. Again, come by the shop, support the show. This year has been critically expensive for us due to just, I'm going to be honest with you, BS. If you are a patron or on Subscribestar, you know some of this because we do a podcast that goes along with every episode. They're not really paired, but they tell about what we're going through in making the show. And so those of you who follow that are fairly up to date. But the short version is Plan A failed last year, Plan B has now failed this year, and I'm trying desperately to leverage a Plan C that will hopefully then bring in more funding for a Plan D. I need to talk about this at some point on the podcast. Anyway, you guys get the idea. Support the show if you can, and then otherwise keep on watching.